Cedar Point's 1989 history-making, record-breaking Arrow Hypercoaster sits alongside world-famous, award-winning roller coasters such as Millennium Force, Top Thrill Dragster and Steel Vengeance, all of which are record-breaking roller coasters and have far more impressive statistics compared to Magnum XL-200. But that doesn't stop Magnum from being ranked as one of the best roller coasters at Cedar Point, or in some cases, the best at Cedar Point. In this video, I'll be talking about why Magnum XL-200 is currently my favourite hypercoaster anywhere in the world, even though it lacks the impressive height, speed and length statistics that newer hypercoasters in the world have got. Let's start by breaking down those statistics. Magnum XL-200 is 205 foot tall, with its tallest drop being 194.7 foot. Its top speed is 72 miles per hour and the length of the ride is 5,106 foot long. Compared to newer hypercoasters out there, which have been designed and built using far more advanced technology, Magnum statistics don't jump out at you. But in 1989, this was the world's tallest and fastest full-circuit roller coaster. Nobody had seen anything like this before. Magnum XL-200 was the roller coaster that inspired Blackpool Pleasure Beach to build the big one, and it was also the driving force behind my first visit to Cedar Point. I just had to go and see how this much-loved Arrow hypercoaster, 9 hours away across the pond, compared to my own favourite hypercoaster, 76 miles from home. I conquered my fear of going on the big one at Blackpool Pleasure Beach in 2004. That eventually led me to showing more interest in roller coasters, and from there I found Coaster Force, where I found out about Cedar Point, and then I found out about Magnum. Fast forward 14 years, and my first trip to Cedar Point was finally planned. For many years, I'd talked up the idea of going with coaster enthusiast friends, but for whatever reason, it just didn't happen. I do regret not going sooner, because I'd have got the bug for visiting new parks and riding new coasters much sooner than I did, which would have probably led to me doing more of the classic aerodynamics roller coasters that are now gone or are going to be gone soon. Anyway, moving on. May 2018 and I finally get to Cedar Point, but the weather was absolutely terrible, so the rides weren't at their peak because of the wind and the rain. Magnum XL-200 was on one train due to high winds and the rain, but at least it was open. Funnily enough, it's the longest I've ever had to wait for Magnum, and probably my least enjoyable ride on it too. But despite of this, I still remember describing it as great, and I was just really happy to have got on it. But at that point in time, I was struggling to separate it from the big one in terms of which was better. I was completely unprepared for the airtime, and on my first go found it quite unbearable on my thighs, but when the time to give it a second go came around, I knew what to expect from the airtime, the quirkiness of hand-built aerodynamics transitions, and the general raucousness of it, but more about all of that later. So Magnum starts on a slight downward straight section of track above the midway before dropping down and turning right, and then it starts to climb to 205 foot. The lift hill is not the fastest of lift hills, but that's not a problem because the views around it are stunning. You can take in the breathtaking views of Cedar Point's attractions all around you, and then there's the great views of Lake Erie too. Oh, and there's also the classic sound of an aerodynamics lift hill. I suppose I've got to mention the big one again here. It's strange how it doesn't sound like the other Arrow lift hills. Okay, this is getting very coaster geeky now. Let's move on. Magnum's first drop is the tallest drop on this roller coaster at 194.7 foot with an angle of 60 degrees. The first drop is not the best first drop on any roller coaster that you'll ride, but it is much better than it looks from an off-ride perspective. I knew it wouldn't have a better first drop than the big one, or newer hypercoasters that I'd been on, so those low expectations helped for sure. The second hill is okay. It's the calm before the storm really, as it features little to no airtime, as well as giving riders their first taste of Arrow quirkiness. It kinda nudges you from right to left as the track curves and begins to dive into the second drop, and then the madness of this roller coaster starts to come together. At the bottom of the second drop, the train flies through the first of a few tunnels, and it goes through at such a speed that it's so noisy as you go through. I love that though, it really adds to the charm of this coaster. The third hill is significantly smaller than drops 1 and 2, so the train goes over it with incredible speed, which gives us riders some of the best airtime you'll experience on any ride at Cedar Point. Following this, the train banks to the left as it passes through its trim brakes, which aren't quiet at all. And then into its pretzel-shaped turnaround. The turnaround is a little bit odd, but it just seems to fit in with the rest of the ride, and in truth the trains absolutely fly around it when the trim brakes are turned off. The trim brakes aren't always on in the morning. We notice that they tend to be in use around an hour into the day onwards. The trim brakes are also switched off in the event of poor weather conditions such as the wind, usually to prevent the possibility of a rollback situation. The track banking shows more signs of the arrow quirkiness as it pulls away from the turnaround. The track banks over to the left before straightening out and proceeding to the legendary triangular Airtime hills, which are what make this coaster stand out above all the other hypercoasters I've done. I may have mentioned this a few times already. This roller coaster was hand designed and hand built using 1980s technology by Aerodynamics, so the ride has its imperfections, but they give this roller coaster charm and character and make it an experience like no other. The Airtime hills start as the train passes through another one of its tunnels, which is equally as loud as the first tunnel. The Airtime makes this ride. If you lose that and the fire slam that goes with it, you might as well just take this coaster down, to be honest. I regularly see comments about its roughness and how it ruins the ride, but I just can't agree with that. It's simply a case of confusing Airtime with roughness. Steel Vengeance, the most loved roller coaster at Cedar Point by most people, slams your thighs on its bulky restraints as well, so why can't Magnum do it? Following the tunnel and the first two triangular Airtime hills is a banked hill with a little bit of airtime before the final sequence of ejector seat triangular Airtime hills begin. The intensity of this coaster really kicks in here, and this is the part of the ride where you really don't want to be pinned down by your lap bar. There's 4 consecutive triangular Airtime hills, which produce some of the best airtime moments I've had on any roller coaster. It is honestly like nothing I've ever experienced on any other roller coaster anywhere in the world. I wouldn't define Magnum's Airtime hills as rough, or any of the ride rough for that matter. It can perhaps be uncomfortable if you're pinned, but rough is the wrong way to describe it in my opinion. For good measure, there's another tunnel too, which leads to the first brake run, known as the safety brake or mid-course brake run. As the train levels out onto that brake run, there's even more ejector seat airtime. From this point onwards, the train slowly makes its way back through some quirky arrow corners, into the ready brake, and finally back to the station. As you enter the station, you're likely to hear a ride attendant say, "Welcome back, riders, how's your ride?" I love how they do that at Cedar Point. It really adds to the atmosphere. If you work at Cedar Point or visit often, please tell me they're going to start doing that again after COVID-19 has gone away. Magnum has 3 trains, each with 6 carriages, so that's a maximum of 36 passengers a time. As somebody who's grown up visiting a part of an Arrow hypercoaster that has 5 carriages, it certainly looks a bit strange seeing that 6th carriage. I've seen comments suggesting that the train should be changed. Now come on, let's not be doing that. Those triangular Airtime hills may not be so good with modern trains with clamshell restraints. If it ain't broke, don't try and fix it. Talking of the trains, I've mentioned the Magic Seat once or twice. The Magic Seat is in reference to row 3, the seat which Magnum fans tend to love the most. It's referred to as the Magic Seat because it has some of the best ejector airtime imaginable. However, I find it to be less enjoyable than the front row, the back row, and another row referred to as a Magic Seat row. Row 16 was recommended to me by a ride-op. It was a great suggestion because there's so much airtime and also the thrill of being in a 6th carriage to go with it. Every row on Magnum guarantees airtime, but if you do get to do this, don't miss out on the chance to ride the front row, row 3, row 16 and the back row. 4 rides on Magnum may seem a bit much, especially if you're short for time when you visit Cedar Point, but the throughput on this coaster helps to keep its queue to a minimum and it does tend to be very quiet in the mornings. So one last comparison with the big one. Magnum XL-200 doesn't have its trains loaded with sandbags for morning testing, and during quieter times doesn't have the back carriages closed off whilst loaded with sandbags. I have noticed that Magnum operates with the middle carriages empty when it's very quiet, with the front and the back of the train loaded, but never with sandbags on the empty rows. Also, I haven't seen Magnum stop for wheel checks either. I'm not sure why this is the case, but it's interesting that 2 coasters which use pretty much the same technology have different policies with these things. Does it matter? Probably not, but there's maybe some fans of the big one and Magnum out there who'd be interested to know this sort of thing. So to summarise, Magnum XL-200 to this day remains as the best hypercoaster I've done, in my opinion. It may not have the best statistics or the newest technology, but it has a fun first drop, excellent airtime hills, and is packed with character that newer coasters can't replicate. Talking about this roller coaster in my recent collaboration with CoasterBot and writing this review has really got me craving a fix of triangular airtime hills at Cedar Point. Unfortunately, that's unlikely this year, but as long as Cedar Point don't decide to remove this roller coaster this year, I'll get to do it again someday. Have you been on Magnum XL-200, or is it a bucket list roller coaster for you? Be sure to let me know in the comments section below. And before you go, please give this video a like if you've enjoyed it. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon in the next Pleasure Beach Experience video.